Hey everyone, thanks so much for stopping by. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Born with a mysterious power tied to the sea itself, a female Luffy grows up hunted by the world government long before she can understand why. When hiding her existence is no longer possible, salvation comes from an unexpected place: the legendary Whitebeard pirates. Taken aboard the Moby Dick alongside Ace, Luffy finds not just protection, but a family that teaches her strength, loyalty, and what it truly means to belong. As she grows under Whitebeard's flag, the story blends found family, adventure, and emotional growth, reimagining Luffy's journey through the warmth and ferocity of the Whitebeard pirates. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is Daughter of the Sea by Kuchia-chi.
Chapter 1: Whitebeard and Sea Kings. Sabo and Luffy were on a small boat that they stole and were headed out to sea, to travel around to the other side of the island. It was the shortest route back to Kuchia village. Ace was watching on a nearby cliff with a smile on his face, happy that his brother and little sister were able to escape without any troubles, but he thought too soon. The celestial dragon had shot at the small boat, setting it aflame. Ace had yelled for his siblings to jump ship and save themselves, but just as the celestial dragon was about to sink it completely, the little 4-year-old Luffy had pushed her older brother into the water, saving him from further injury while Luffy had taken the shot harshly. "Luffy!" Sabo shouted, and before he could climb onto the wreckage to save his sister, the Lord of the Coast had snatched him up by his shirt and dragged him to the cliff where Ace was waiting for them. Sabo shot around and glared at the Sea King. "Ko, why didn't you save Luffy? She's your friend, isn't she?" The dark brown beast only shook its head before diving back into the water. Luffy was his master and she had ordered him to save her brother, and that was what he did, and he needed to help heal her wounds as soon as possible. Ace and Sabo stared at the burning remains of the boat. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a flaming blue bird had swooped down to boat, clutching a bloodied body in its talons, and made its way to the cliff where Ace and Sabo were, gently laying down the girl on the soft grass. The boys darted to their little sister, who was covered from head to toe in her own blood. They didn't touch her, but they could make out the rise and fall of her chest. It was only a matter of time till she lost too much blood. The Sea King had returned. Its large head broke the surface of the water. A vial filled with a sparkling blue substance clenched between its teeth and dropped it on his master's lap. Ace was quick to make Luffy drink the liquid. They had dealt with the unique substance before when the girl was heavily injured. They poured the blue liquid into her mouth, and before they knew it, she had woken up like she was late for something important. She glanced around at her surrounding and spotted her worried brothers. "Sabo ni, are you okay?" The little girl spat out. Her older brother was on the brink of tears but nodded his head. Ace, on the other hand, grew more and more furious. "You idiot, you're lucky to be alive. Don't worry about Sabo, he's fine. What the hell were you thinking?" Ace screamed. Luffy cringing as he continued to scold her. She felt a change in the ocean's features and turned to look out to the sea to see a gigantic boat with a whale figurehead, a man with a white crescent mustache that curled towards the sky and scars littered over his chest, standing at the head of the boat. They all heard him yell in a booming voice, "I'm placing this island under my protection. The nobles are to leave immediately. I won't tolerate your insolence here. This island is mine." The celestial dragon had attempted to fight back but was only to be punched further than they had expected. The government wasn't going to be happy with the sudden news. Whitebeard had received the news of the safety of the residents on the boat and had docked the Moby Dick at Kuchia village. There wasn't too much hassles from the citizens. They had dealt with a few pirates before, but no one liked them. But he waited there for his son Marco to return with the child that he saved, regardless. Ace, Sabo and Luffy were walking to Kuchia village. Ace had given up his shirt to cover the bloodied clothes. They did thank the man that had saved their sister's life. Even if they shouldn't have to worry about her, they couldn't help it because Luffy was a child of the sea and she wasn't going to die from something as simple as that for a long time. But it still worried them nonetheless. They reached the docks where Whitebeard towered over the children. Ace and Sabo could feel the intimidating aura the man emitted, but Luffy had other ideas. "You're huge and so old. Are those scars real? Are you devil fruit user? That punch was so cool, but I'm sure I could have taken care of it." She beamed. Ace and Sabo slammed a hand over their sister's mouth before she got them all killed, but Whitebeard just gave a hearty laugh and patted the little girl's head, despite getting blood on his huge hands. "Gururara, they're real and I am devil fruit user. You're a cheeky brat, aren't you?" He stared down at the little girl who had already taken a full recovery from her injuries. "What's your name?" Luffy ripped her brother's hands from her mouth, took a quick breath before she could talk to the man. Still smiling her toothy smile, she replied, "Monkey D. Luffy." She pointed to the older boys next to her. "These are my brothers, Ace ni and Sabo ni." Ace turned to Sabo, nodding their heads in unison, picked up their little sister and sprinted in the other direction before she talked too much for their own comfort. The pirates didn't need to know what could get them into trouble. Whitebeard and Marco stared at the running children and then stared at each other before laughing. "They're real interesting kids, aren't they, son?" Whitebeard said. "They sure are, but something concerns me," he stated, seizing the laughter to a halt before he continued. "When I pulled the girl out of the rumble, she was covered head to toe in her own blood, and when I dropped her off at the cliff, a sea king had come out of the water and gave them a vial that healed all of the girl's wound instantaneously. This caused a many eyebrows to arch. They have never heard of a sea king helping someone or a medicine that could cure injuries miraculously. However, it certainly made their stay on the island all the more interesting." Whitebeard and Marco had heard footsteps approaching and watched as a woman with dark green hair with a bandana wrapped over her head and an apron making her way towards them casually, with a soft smile on her face. "I'm Makino, the owner of the local bar. The boys have told me how you saved Luffy and I must thank you for all your help. Please feel free to come and have a drink and a meal whenever you feel like, and if you have any questions feel free to ask." Makino was the type to welcome guests with open arms, and since they saved Luffy from possible death she had taken upon herself to thank the men even if they were pirates. She wasn't one to judge a person by whatever title that was given to them and waited patiently for their reply to offer. The pirates stared at the woman. Marco was the first to ask his question. "I was wondering about Luffy. She seems to have some sort of power but we don't know what. Would you know?" Makino tapped a finger against her chin. She had known the girl since she came to the island and then shook her head to the blonde-haired man's question. "Luffy was found on the beach wrapped in a blanket with nothing but her necklace with her name on it and lived with her brothers up at the mountain bandit's house. I've never seen her with any sort of powers, so to speak. I would say to ask them, but they're pretty withdrawn at the moment due to the earlier incident, but they are really lovely kids. It just takes a bit of time to trust other people." With an acknowledging nod from the man, Makino left to bring the beer to the pirate ship. They had earned it, and even if the mayor was practically the opposite towards people with titles, it wasn't going to stop her from acknowledging the pirates. Ace and Sabo glared down at their little sister rather harshly. They didn't know how long they could put up with her blunt antics. She had caused a lot of troubles for them. They were sitting at the cliff debating what to argue about first. "Luffy, you're stupidly lucky Ko came with the vial. Do you know how lucky you are?" Ace said harshly, still glaring daggers at the girl. "But I knew Mama could heal me. That's why I pushed Sabo knee before he got injured." Tears were threatening to spill out of her eyes, but she held strong. She tightened her hold on her shirt and refused to show her tears to her brothers. She was a strong girl after all. Ace and Sabo felt like they had kicked a puppy and hugged her at the same time, and the tears natural flowed their cause and stained Sabo clothes and soaked Ace's bare shoulder. They heard the water next them break and they watched as Lord of the Coast had his gaze on the little girl. "Luffy-sama, the pirates have taken up the bar. What are you going to do?" She wiped away the tears away forcefully, rubbing her eyes until they were red. She thought about what the Sea King had said and then informed her brothers about the little message, and they all grew devilish smirks. For the past couple of days that the Whitebeard pirates were on Dawn Island, they were faced with countless pranks from the children and were growing more paranoid with every corner they turned. Ace and Sabo were practically killing themselves over how hilarious the crew's reaction of the whole thing was to them. They decided to give them a break for the day just to see how paranoid they were. Luffy was drinking juice at Makino's bar, happily swinging her feet over the stool that was located at the counter. Marco had walked into the bar exhausted from the previous day's antics and spotted the little girl drinking juice at the counter and sat down next to her. "Luffy," he said as he sat down next the girl at the counter. She turned her attention to the man who had saved her life but didn't put the glass down. She gave a slight nod, indicating that she was listening slightly. "I want to ask you a few questions." Luffy placed her glass down, giving him her full attention. She wasn't going to be rude after all. "Shoot," she replied. Marco debated to himself on which question to ask first. There were so many that littered throughout his mind and then came to one. "What are you?" The question sounded very rude when it was said. Things always sounded better in someone's head, though to his surprise Luffy didn't even give a second thought before answering and wasn't the slightest bit offended. "I'm the daughter of the sea." Luffy grinned, obviously proud of that fact, and then stared at the blonde-haired man. His face was blank with confusion and obviously didn't understand the point she was trying to get across. She stared at her hand, waited till Marco's gaze followed hers and changed her hand into a dragon-like claw that was littered with ruby-red scales and long deadly nails and held it up to him. "Is it a devil fruit?" Her expression wasn't one that Marco was expecting. She looked like she was going to murder someone. He harshly swallowed the lump in throat and continued with the nervous eye contact. "I would never go near one of those fruits, plus Mama personally drowns all of them. No exception." Marco was getting more curious by what the girl said. "Who's Mama?" But before Luffy could continue blabbering her mouth off, Ace had swooped in and stole his sister back. Marco sighed as he saw his chance for answers get dragged away by a 10-year-old boy. Ace had dragged Luffy all the way back to the cliff where he sat her down and scolded her about telling them too much information and told her to stay put. Sabo was feeding the local Sea King and was needed come help, so he left soon after. Luffy did as Ace had told her to do and waited patiently, swinging her legs over the edge, but was soon knocked unconscious by something hard to her head. Ace and Sabo were on their way back to their sister but saw her being carried off by a different group of mountain bandits. Dayton's group, though they were the toughest in the area, weren't stupid enough to attack Luffy, however, these bandits were.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
Sabo, go find help now. I'll follow them and make sure Luffy's okay. Ace ordered. Sabo didn't need any further instruction and ran in the direction of the village. Ace had followed the bandits. He wanted to kill them all for harming Luffy, but if he were to advance, they could kill her without a second thought. The next simplest thing to do, the only thing he could do, was follow them to their hideout. Sabo raced through the village in hope of finding someone help their sister. He knew that she could always ask her mother for help, but she was too damn stubborn for her own good sometimes. He ran to the party bar. No one was there. He sprinted to the docks and found Marco and Whitebeard talking about something and noticed the distressed boy. Jogging up to him, they watched as he stopped, his hands on his knees while he caught his breath. Sabo, what's the matter? Marco asked, trying to keep the calm in his voice to reassure the boy. It's Luffy, she was taken by mountain bandits. Ace is following them. Sabo huffed. Once gaining enough strength, he tugged on Marco's shirt shield and led them in the direction of the forest. Once they had reached the forest, Marco picked up the boy and ran in the direction Sabo had instructed, Whitebeard following behind them. They soon caught up to Ace, who, running towards them, obviously held knowledge of their little sister's location and told them that he found where they were. Marco had released his hold on the top-hatted child and watched as they zipped through the dense brush. Ace and Sabo were actually a lot faster than they imagined and made their way to a beaten-down hut in a clearing. It looked like one of the buildings pulled out of Grey Terminal. The brothers nodded to each other before running to an open window and peeked in to see the little girl tired up, short black hair ruffled up and white shirt covered in dirt, shorts torn apart and in tatters. Luffy's breaths were heavy, a cough and blood trickled down tiny chin. The boys were filled with rage to see their little sister in such a condition. They were about to storm in and destroy anything in their path, but a hand was placed on each of the brothers' shoulders. Marco had finally caught up with the boys and stopped them from doing anything too dangerous, otherwise the little girl was going to be in enough trouble than she wanted to get herself into. They heard footsteps shift in the hut and turned attention to hone in on their conversation. That's a pretty necklace you've got there, girly, the head bandit said as he stalked his way to Luffy. He gave her a toothy grin, as he eyed the golden necklace that hung low around her scrawny neck. Don't touch my necklace. Her voice alone could have stopped anyone in their footsteps, but it didn't take long for the head of the bandits to recover and continue casually strolling up to the girl. The leader just knelt down to her height and clutched the pure golden necklace in his hand. Rubbing the smooth surface against thick-skinned thumb, Ace and Sabo started trembling in their spot. Marco looked down at the boys, tightening grip on the boys to prevent them from moving, thinking that they further enraged, but he was wrong when he saw the absolute terror in their eyes. Sabo was the first to react and yelled in a hushed tone. We need to get out of here. If he takes off that necklace, it's going to be the end of us. Just as he said that, the sound of scraping of metal came from the inside of the hut. Ace had grabbed Sabo's hand, the other gripping onto Marco's arm, and they dragged themselves back into the forest to see Whitebeard keeping his distance. When they reached a safe distance, they watched as the hut crumbled away and a ruby-red serpent, thick red fins on its arms, a dragon-like head, raven mane and twin twisted horns sprouting from its head. Its scaly body grew larger than anything they have ever seen. Even Whitebeard was surprised to see something probably 20, maybe 30 times larger than himself. This is what she meant by daughter of the sea, Marco muttered. Luffy's serpent form was witnessed all over Dawn Island and wasn't taken lightly. Screams could be heard all the way from the town. After Luffy had crushed the bandits from under her, she spotted Whitebeard, Marco and her brothers staring up at her. She turned her head away in shame and dragged her snake-like body into the ocean and stayed deep under the water surface until things settled down. A similar incident happened before and she had to live under the water for a 2-month. She withered in loneliness. She wanted to see Ace, Sabo, Makino and the mayor, but knew it would put them in harm's way. Marines had swarmed the island in search of the supposed Sea King and claimed in on the safety of the residents that they stayed for a while, but when Luffy refused to surface until given word from her friend, Ko. She wasn't already in a very bad mental condition. Ace watched his sister slide into the ocean and wasted no time to rush to the ruins to find her golden chain. Sabo had joined the search. When Ace had finally gathered all of the pieces, he went back to Marco with the glittering golden seashell with the girl's name in and thrusted it into his face. His expression was filled with anger, hatred and determination. Marco, can you please help her? If she has to go through something like this again, I don't know how long it'll be till we see her again, and I'm positive the Marines will come to take her now that they know she's here. Ace wasn't the one to beg, but his sister's life was once again in terrible danger. She'll be dragged away if they didn't do something quick. Marco stared down at the gold chain, pulled it in his hand. It was a lot heavier than he had originally thought, and they all rushed back to the town. The villagers had spotted the Red Sea King and were running around panicking. Ace had explained along the way that the necklace was from her mother to keep her from transforming when she got too emotional. The sooner they fixed it and got it back around her neck, the sooner she could come home, though they couldn't really call it home anymore. Sabo had interjected at this point to ask them something. "Whitebeard, it may be a lot to ask, but can you take us with you on your voyage? Luffy isn't safe here anymore and family sticks together." Ace nodded his head in agreement. He wasn't going anywhere without Luffy. Whitebeard only smiled at the boy's little speech. "Well said. Welcome to the family, my sons." Chapter 2, Family Consent. Sabo found himself sitting on the Moby Dick's railing, watching the sea in anticipation, hoping to see that little flicker of red on the surface of the water. Ace was pacing around the deck, waiting for the necklace to be mended, when Marco had handed it to some of the most skilled blacksmiths on the ship. Though they had said it was going to be a difficult job but a quick one, it didn't stop Ace from wearing down the floorboards. Marco was also waiting in the crude science for his crew to finish repairing the golden necklace and then decided to receive some answers to his unanswered questions. "Ace, why would the Navy so worried about a really large Sea King?" Ace stopped pacing and Sabo had turned around to join in on the conversation. Ace took over first, walking over the 1st Division commander to keep word from spreading. They had enough trouble throughout the whole week and didn't need bounty hunters on their tails. "It's not because Luffy's a Sea King. It's her mother." "Who's her mother?" "An even bigger Sea King." He joked, but they both shook their heads. Grim expressions flushed over their usual cheerful faces. Sabo's hat had shadowed his face as he stared down at the deck. Ace had allowed his bangs to hide his expression, though it wasn't doing much good. "It's sea itself," Ace muttered so softly that even he had trouble hearing himself. They sat down in a triangle on one side of the deck away from the hustle and bustle of the other crewmates. Keeping things low was important at this moment in time. If the crew wanted to know, then all they had to do was ask, but right at that moment wasn't the best. "Luffy told us that every 1,000 years a child is born from the sea. She's capable of commanding all that live in the ocean, that's fishmen to mermaids to sea kings and even the water itself. But why the government want her for is because the sea will do anything for her. She would be considered a valuable weapon for the world government." Sabo took in a breath before pointing something else out that would have been a great concern. The government would have need to use the Buster Call because there, if she were to be a weapon, it would be easy. There wouldn't be any evidence of anyone being there. Sabo explained how when he was taken back by his parents to continue being their heir, Luffy had smashed down the front gate and most of the mansion single-handedly. When she reached the office where he, his father and mother were waiting, Luffy had asked her mother to sink exactly half of his father's ships. A moment later he had received a call that exactly what she asked happened and threatened that if they didn't return Sabo to her side she would pull their whole business into the ground. After that, they made their escape on the little boat that was hit by the celestial dragon. Marco was shocked to hear what that little girl was capable of, such destruction, and understood why the government would want her so badly. He felt the need to protect his new little sister. Just before they could continue their talk, the blacksmiths had returned from the lower parts of the Moby Dick with the necklace in their hands and headed towards the trio. Marco was relieved when he saw the jewelry in one piece. Sabo had jumped up and snatched the golden chain into his hand, thanked the man for his fine work and rushed over to Ace, who was still sitting on the deck, staring out at the sea. "Ace, do you still have that whistle?" Sabo asked desperately. Ace nodded and pulled out a long silver whistle tied to a piece of silk red string out of his pants pocket. Pulling it close to his lips and let out a hard breath. There was no sound and Marco questioned what it was supposed to do. That was until the 8th Division commander came up to the deck blocking his ears. Whether fishmen had ears or not, I'm not sure, just presume they do. The fishman, Namur, had heard an ear-piercing whistle and was determined to find out what it was. Storming onto the deck and over to the higher-ranking commander, who had 2 kids with him at the moment. "What the hell was that?" Namur grumbled rather loudly. Marco, however, only gave him a questionable look of confusion. "You heard it?" Marco questioned. Namur was about to retort back, but a giant leather-brown sea king with a blue hair sticking up and piercing red eyes had broke the surface of the water and made its way to the railing of the Moby Dick. Sabo and Ace walked up to the railing in a rather calm manner as the rest of the crew who were on board were getting ready for a battle. "Ko, we got Luffy's necklace repaired and we need you to convince her to come to the ship. No matter what." Sabo's voice was stern as he threw the necklace to the Sea King with full force and watched as it caught the jewelry in between its teeth and dived back into the ocean to find their little sister. The rest of the day, Sabo and Ace had returned to Dayton's place to pack up all of their things. Marco had accompanied them and was talking to their caretaker about the children. She didn't say much considering they were always running around the forest and not doing their chores, but she did ask him to look after the brats. They were going to be a handful. By the time they returned to the ship they found a very tired Luffy sitting on top of Whitebeard's lap, as he sat in his throne in all his glory. Whitebeard still didn't know how the girl got there in the first place, but she looked like she had another exhausting day and wasn't going to bother his new daughter. Unfortunately for him, Ace and Sabo had other ideas. "Oi, Luffy, you can't just go sitting wherever you want," Ace yelled. Whitebeard chuckled and watched as the girl still had the energy to fight with her brothers. Sat up, hands in between her legs to level herself and glared at the boys way below her. I sit where I want and Papa doesn't mind. Ace raised an eyebrow. Papa, I thought we call him Pops. The 3rd Division commander, a large man, bodied in armor, took it upon himself to inform the tiny boys of the situation at hand. After witnessing the argument between his captain and the little girl, he had a lot of conflicting feelings about the debate. Jozu wasn't one to stand in between a fight with his captain, but he had lost against the 4-year-old girl in the most confusing argument he had ever heard in his life. Your little sister seems to have other ideas. They went on a complete debate about it and her sense of logic had won in her favor. I'm still not too sure how it happened either. Quote, the crew watched as pity wash over the 2 young boys' faces as they stared up at their captain. Whitebeard only gave another hearty laugh when he saw his sons' faces. They had obviously dealt with the little girl's unusual sense of persuasion. He turned to the rest of his sons as he announced that they were having a party for their new little brothers and sister. Cheers rang out and Whitebeard was even happier when Luffy had convinced the nurses to let him drink as much as he wanted. They set out to sea the next day, the children waving their farewells to the villagers, but something was bothering the boys. Ace jumped down from the railing and headed back towards the deck. Luffy, what happens when Gigi hears about this? Ace asked. He watched as Luffy climbing her way onto Whitebeard's lap like he was a bloody mountain in her way. The giant man looked down to his youngest son with a raised eyebrow. Who's your old man? He asked. Ace shifted under his gaze. Sabo had walked back onto the deck to answer the question when he heard it. Garp. Sabo replied from the other side of the deck, stopping all the conversations from the pirates on the deck. The marine hero. Sabo nodded his head, his eyes watching his little sister sprawled out across Whitebeard's leg in exhaustion, not a care in the world, like she had completed her life goal. Climbing Whitebeard like a mountain. Ace was shuffling around but had enough and sat down, huffing under his breath. Crazy old man will find us sooner or later. Just as he said that, the whistling of a cannon firing drew the crew's gaze to the marine ship with a dog figurehead and a certain vice admiral launching himself onto the Moby Dick. Garp looked about the ship and spotted his little angel on Whitebeard's lap, waving her hand to her grandfather, Ace grumbling under his breath on the deck, and no doubt that if both of them were there, then Sabo was close by too. Oi, Ji-chan, Luffy cheered. She wasn't too worried about her adoptive grandfather attempting to take her back because she could always sink his ship, in the amount of times she had did that he had finally gave into her reasoning and didn't bother her about a lot of things. Luffy, what are you doing? Get down from there, I'm taking you and your brothers home. Garp growled. Ace was the voice of reason for once and stood back up, glaring at the old marine. No can do, old man. The island's seen Luffy too many times and Pops agreed to take care of us. Well, I'm not letting you become pirates. Yeah, well, we're not letting our little sister become a weapon for the Marines. The 10-year-old yelled, and he had a point that even Garp couldn't argue with. He didn't like the idea of his grandkids becoming pirates, but at the very least they had their freedom, and a small part of him, a very small part, trusted Whitebeard that he would keep them safe at all cost. Whitebeard, Garp said, though I don't like to admit it, but I trust that you'll keep them safe. Whitebeard nodded his head. He was honestly expecting to fight the man, but with what Ace had said he could understand what the Marine was going through. It was going to be even harder for him when they got bounties on their heads. With that, the Marines left without a fight. Though some of the pirates were disappointed, the more experienced ones were happy that they didn't have to face the marine hero. Luffy had regained her energy and spent the rest of the day exploring the enormous ship, talking with a lot of the other pirates, and figured to keep herself from getting lost she sat on the figurehead and watched the sea as the sun set. Ace and Sabo were watching their sister when Thatch, the 4th Division commander, had walked up to ask something. I know the figurehead is huge, but what if she falls off? Sabo looked up to the man with the ridiculous hair with a, "Are you stupid?" look. Even if she did, I don't think any of us will need to worry about, the girl can breathe underwater. That was when Ace had an even more important question to ask. When's dinner? Just the word had caught the little girl's ears and she had already sprinted at Thatch and tackled him, clasping her whole body around the man's waist and resisted to remove herself. Yeah, when's dinner? Her cheery little voice rang like bells. Thatch could only laugh, picking up the girl and walked them to the dining room, where everyone was all over the place grabbing whatever they could before it disappeared. They followed the commander to their table and gaped at the amount of food that was displayed. Luffy jumped out of Thatch's grip and joined her brothers in inhaling the food. The commanders laughed at the sight of their youngest siblings and was slightly amazed that they were capable of eating just as much as their captain. They were going to have a lot interesting experiences with their new brothers and sister. Chapter 3, Taking a Nap. Luffy was the type of girl who always followed her brothers around everywhere, since they were the only people who she loved spending time with the most. But now that their family was even bigger, she wanted to spend time with everyone, but even she wasn't capable of causing that much trouble, even with her brother's help. It was very difficult pranking over 1,600 men. Luffy was lying on Whitebeard, again. Arms tucked nicely behind her head, watching the birds in the sky swoop past them with all the freedom in the world. She then rolled her eyes back and watched the overly large man with a sake bottle pressed to his lips. Curiosity was a good and bad trait of the little girl, but most of the time it was a bad trait with all the times Ace and Sabo had scolded her over it. "Papa," Luffy said, gaining the man's attention and placing the large bottle next to him but waited for her to continue. "What did you do before we came on board?" Whitebeard only gave a smile to his youngest. He told her most of the adventures that he went on, but what he wanted the most was a family. All over the world they had heard his name and how he was famous for fighting the Pirate King, Gall D. Roger on par. That was when he noticed that Luffy hadn't commented until he looked down at the cute little 4-year-old. "Cool, you met Ace's dad." The excitement in her voice soon trailed off and then went to a rather concerned yet nonchalant. "I wasn't supposed to say that. Don't tell Ace I said that, he's touchy on the subject." Then jumped off his lap to find a place to hide before her brother heard she that spilt the beans and hunted her down. There wasn't much that frightened her, but Ace had declared their sibling relationship off because of it and she didn't appreciate it one bit. Ace had some sort of radar in him, that sensed when he was being talked about and walked onto the deck and over to Pops. They make eyes contact and it lasted a long time till the large man started to talk. "Your father's Roger," he murmured, completely ignoring his daughter's warning. He watched Ace boiled over with rage and caution. "Who told you that?" Whitebeard raised an eyebrow. "Take a guess." Whitebeard wasn't one to play games, but he could tell that Ace was quick on his feet when he was mad. He spotted flames flickering off his shoulders and his hair. Whitebeard figured he was a devil fruit user. "I don't see why you're so angry. Roger may be your father, but so am I. It doesn't matter who your parents are. We are all children of the sea and you're my son." Quote. Ace could only stare at the man in amazement. He let his anger die down before Whitebeard spoke again. "You ate a devil fruit, didn't you?" He nodded his head but didn't say anything. Whitebeard had instructed him to train his powers before something bad happened and then asked if Sabo had a devil fruit. Ace shook his head. His older brother was stronger than him, even with his devil fruit. Ace went off somewhere on the ship to train his powers and spotted Luffy following Marco around. He stormed up the sister and proceeded to choke her, throwing her head around the place. Luffy's brain was most going so haywire at the moment, that she couldn't see the person in front of her and putting pieces together wasn't her sort of thing. She left it to Sabo. "You little twerp. No matter how many times I tell you not to do something, you always go and do it." He dropped her back on her feet, sighing in defeat and pointed every harsh finger at her. "One of these days I swear, whatever it is, it's going to bite you in the butt." Luffy was happy that she got away with minor injuries this times and went back to chasing Marco around. After all, he was going to teach her how to control her transformation, and after multiple attempts at the transformation and holding it place, Luffy was capable of turning into her other form but smaller, with the necklace on. The enchanted gold stopped her from going crazy and crushing everything in sight when she was younger, but she soon had complete control over it, as did Ace with his fire and Sabo was training with his lead pipe elsewhere. Even though the Whitebeard pirates had grown accustomed to their new little siblings, one thing that they didn't like was when one went missing. They had returned to the Grand Line a couple of months ago and only found out about their youngest going missing was when her brothers noticed the absence. Ace and Sabo were running around trying to find Luffy all over the ship and hadn't found a trace of her anywhere. Usually she was following one of the commanders for the day or sitting on Whitebeard's lap, but that wasn't the case. Ace had made his way to Marco, who had watched the boys from a distance on the deck. They looked like they were looking for something or someone, but now their faces looked desperate. Marco had sat up as Ace had his hands on his knees, releasing a word through each breath. "Have you seen Luffy?" "No, I heard one of the other commanders say that she was going to take a nap." "What? That's worst." Ace sprinted off again, but this time along the railing, and ran into Sabo along the way and shouted at each other about something that Marco couldn't quite catch. He watched as the siblings had ran off again in another direction, that being, the direction of Pop's chair. Marco had got up and ran to see what the issue was and saw Ace and Sabo trying to catch their breath before speaking. "Pops, it's terrible," Ace shouted. "What is it?" Whitebeard knew that if both of the siblings were running around without a call of a fire was something to be concerned about. "Luffy took a nap and we can't find her." He raised an eyebrow in confusion. If that were it, then there wouldn't be anything to worry about, but it was when Sabo had interjected that raised the alarms. "No, when Luffy takes a nap she sleeps on the surface of the water, she's not any around the Moby Dick and we can't find her. The current's taken her away and who knows when she'll wake up." "What?" Marco and Whitebeard yelled. Whitebeard jumped out of his seat, knocking over all of his medical equipment. The sound of the crashing equipment and the shouting was enough for the nurses and commanders to come running to the scene. Thatch was first to ask what the matter was, and Whitebeard wasn't happy with the fact that his youngest was missing. "A member of our family's missing. Luffy's missing. I want her found and I want her found now." The nurses were panicking about their captain's health while the pirates were jumping into their boats in a hurry to find their missing little sister, and since they had returned to the Grand Line, finding her was going to be difficult. Drifting along the waves was a little girl with cropped black hair and a gold necklace. A ship was passing by had picked up the girl. She was sound asleep the whole time and wasn't planning on waking up anytime soon. The captain of the boat, an infamous red-haired pirate, saw the necklace with the girl's name on it, and then turned it over to see an even more infamous Jolly Roger carved into the back. They were going to have to make a detour to return Whitebeard's youngest daughter before something very unwanted came to them. The captain ordered to have their course changed and prepare for battle with the Marines. The Marines weren't stupid enough to allow two Yonko to meet up, no matter how trivial the matter of discussion was. All the commanders had returned from their search of the area and hadn't found any sign of the missing 4-year-old in the past 5 hours. The crew was getting antsy when Ace was storming around, flames flickering from his shoulders. Sabo was attempting to keep a level head about it, since a similar incident like this had happened before, but they were on the Grand Line and Marco was having an even more difficult time since he's never dealt with a missing member of the family. Whitebeard glared down at the man that had boarded his ship, obviously not in the mood to put up with anyone, no matter who they were. This red-haired captain didn't take any notice of the giant and raised one arm to show that he meant no harm. "What do you want, brat? We're in the middle of something," Whitebeard growled. Shanks chuckled. Whitebeard really was worried about his daughter. He shifted his long black cape to unveil the sleeping 4-year-old. Whitebeard sank down into his seat and called off the search party. Ace, Sabo and Marco were the first on the scene to see their little sister still sleeping in the arms of the Yonko. The brothers rushed over to the man and Marco had taken the sleeping girl from the other Yonko, thanked him and grabbed the girl's brothers. "Come on you two, we've all had a very busy day. I think we all need some sleep." The brothers yawned stiffly and followed Marco through the hallways to their room. Luffy had shifted in the familiar presence and slowly woke up and saw Marco carrying her with Ace and Sabo by his side. "Sorry Marco ni if I caused any trouble," she mumbled. Marco could only sigh. His little sister was going to get herself into a lot of trouble if she kept it up. "You're not taking naps in the sea anymore, is that understood?" "Fine," she said as she snuggled her head into the man's chest and fell right back to sleep. All of them had fallen asleep when they reached the room. Marco didn't have the strength to return to his room and stayed with the kids overnight. Shanks and his crew had apparently also spent the night partying away, but mostly because red-haired pirates captain wanted to meet the little girl they returned. By the time Luffy had woken up in the morning, she made a beeline to Pop's room and climbed her way onto the old man's chests and sat there till he woke up. "Luffy, what are you doing?" Whitebeard asked. He didn't mind having his daughter sit on him since she was light as a feather, but being woken up was a first. "Papa, I'm hungry. When's breakfast?" She pouted. After her disappearing act the other day she didn't have anything to eat and most likely going to eat 3 times as much as she usually did. No matter where she went, she was always going to be his daughter and act the same. "Gururara, let's get some breakfast then, shall we?" Chapter 4, Something New. It was another day on the Moby Dick, where a 6-year-old girl was sitting on the lap of the strongest man in the world without a care. Luffy was humming a little tune to herself and watched the Sea Kings pass the ship. She missed her friend who stayed behind in the East Blue to keep an eye on the island for them. Over the 2 years Luffy spent with the Whitebeard pirates she adapted a new trick of controlling water. Marco had figured it was just part of being the sea's daughter and then was finalized when a fishman by the name of Jinbei came for a friendly visit. Jinbei was defiantly wise for his age and always showed respect to those of a higher class, in his case, Luffy. Namur had spotted the giant fishman before Luffy had the chance to smack him with her tail back into the sea. Luffy didn't like being treated like a deity and had thrown the 8th Division commander over the railing countless times till he finally gave up. There was no telling what the little girl was capable of doing. Jinbei had taken the other fishman's advice highly and spotted the little girl sitting on the old man's lap and gasped at the sight. He never would have imagined the feared Whitebeard to have a little girl casually sit on his lap and not care what he thought. Whitebeard saw the face of his old fishman friend and laughed at the sight. He patted the little girl on the head to catch her attention and then held out his hand to Jinbei. "Luffy, meet Jinbei. I called him here to teach you about that water ability of yours." Luffy turned to look at the blue fishman wearing a loose robe that showed a huge sun tattoo on his chest. Luffy found his beard to be the oddest of things but knew that if he was Pop's friend then there was no doubt in her mind that he was a someone to highly trust. She jumped down from Whitebeard's lap with a bit of a thud, then sprinted past the fishman, turned around and jumped onto his back. Jinbei was amazed to say the least that she was the sea deity that ruled the ocean and was acting so childish even if she was just a child. Whitebeard just laughed at his youngest action. Jinbei had trained the girl for a couple of months and had admitted that she was extremely fast learner. Luffy had mastered fishman karate, turned herself to water for defense and her serpent form for offense. The girl was most likely unstoppable, but also the most careless person the fishman had ever met. That didn't stop him from liking the girl nonetheless. Luffy was running around the confusing set of corridors till she ran into the 16th Division commander and went up to him for some help. The cross-dressing man, Izo, had felt a small tug on his kimono and looked down at his little sister who was wearing a green shirt and black shorts. He noticed the blank expression on her face and knelt down to her level to look her in the eyes. "Luffy-chan, what's the matter? You look lost." "Izo ne, have you seen Ace ni or Sabo ni?" Luffy, when she was littler, originally though Izo was a woman due to the way he dressed, but calling him her big brother didn't seem to fit, so she just continued calling him her sister, he didn't seem to mind. He always had a lot of dressing tips along with Haruta, the 12th Division commander, were the ones to take it upon themselves to make sure Luffy acted like a lady but went nowhere with the plan, and ended up being closer than ever. Ace and Sabo. Have you tried the kitchen? Izo replied. Luffy shook her head. Thanks, Izo nay. Luffy waved her hand as she skipped down the hallway to continue her search. Luffy happily skipped down the large hallway and noticed someone walking in the other direction. In Luffy's opinion he stuck out of place. The man was around 18 or younger, lengthy black hair that stopped mid-neck, dead expression, wearing a black suit and was walking calmly towards her. Luffy found him odd but didn't bother, since Ace and Sabo came first. Just as she going to pass the man, he grabbed her around the neck and forced the struggling 6-year-old into the air and against the wall. Izo was about to go back to whatever he was doing when he heard a high-pitched scream that filled the whole ship. He was just about to run to Luffy but instead watched as said little girl had darted past him and away to the main deck in the blink of an eye, and following her was a dark-haired boy with the expression of murder on his face, disappearing after her. Izo followed the two hoping to find out what on earth was going on and help save his little sister from whatever had her screaming. Luffy had ran through the hallways and made her way onto the deck. Some of the crew spotted the little girl and were about to ask her what the matter was till they were cut short when she made a mad dash to Pop's throne. Knowing fully well that he was there, the man pursuing her had followed close behind her, anger slowly filling him. He darted around the side of the ship to cut the girl off and he was too fast for any of the pirates to catch him. Luffy was just about to make it to Whitebeard when she saw the darkened figure tackle her to the ground. She once again struggling under his grasp. Whitebeard had heard his little girl scream from the lower deck, and when she did something like that it raised high alarms. He knew that she would come to him, so he patiently waited for Luffy to show up, then saw her running like her life was in danger and then get tackled to the ground by a dark-haired man in a suit. Luffy screamed again and dragged the whole crew onto the deck. Papa, make him stop. Whitebeard was just about to get out of his seat to swat the boy away until she continued with something that they all weren't expecting. It tickles. Make him stop. He keeps poking me. The gaping looks she got meant that they weren't going to help her, so Luffy did the honors of thrusting a hard-scaled leg right where the sun doesn't shine and jumped out of the man's grip. Luffy saw the painful expression on her attacker and half the crew as they watched the torturous experience happen before them and darted her way onto her father's lap, where she knew all peace resided. Whitebeard stared down at his daughter. She had an obvious struggle, her hair was all over the place and there were holes in the chest of her green shirt and a triumphant look on her face. Luffy, what happened? He asked. Luffy had this odd look on her features when she explained. This guy was walking up to me and then grabbed around the neck and started jabbing me with his finger into my chest. It tickled like hell, and Harutane said that if anyone made me uncomfortable, kicking them between the legs would stop them in their tracks. The crew turned to a sheepish-looking Haruta, but before Luffy would continue, the man was on his feet and launched himself at the girl, only to get swatted away by the old man and into the ocean. Someone go get him, I want answers. Whitebeard ordered. Chapter 5, Pillow Duty. The man that was sitting before them on the deck was Rob Lucci, sent by the world government. If Luffy wasn't fighting for the world government then she had to be exterminated, and they sent their top member of the CP9, Rob Lucci, to do the job. Luffy was baffled by the man's being and looked up at Whitebeard. Papa, isn't that mission kind of, Luffy said, impossible. She knew fully well that at her level, that even Haki couldn't stop her from changing to water, and the chances of her death were impossible at that point. Whitebeard knew all the training his daughter went through, her lifespan wasn't going to wither, and then went back to Lucci. You won't return until you complete your mission, will you? He asked. Lucci only glowered at the man. The chief director of CP9 had told him the mission had 99% chance of failing, but when he received the job he would stop at nothing till he knew fully well that the little girl's blood was on his hands. He was going to be staying on this ship for a long time. Day after day Lucci had sneakily attacked the girl and learned over time that the only time he could not attack her was when she napping. The pirate crew had told him, despite being a member of the government countless times, not to disturb her when she was asleep. However, he foolishly did exactly what not to. Luffy had tied him up with her tail, with a death grip and a most monstrous glare that even the old man was afraid of, and then proceeded to throw him far into the ocean, only to be eaten by a sea king. Luffy didn't care, she knew he would survive something as simple as that, and glared at the sea. Marco was leaning against the railing and watched the whole scene in amusement. Anyone with a brain would know not to wake the little girl when she took her nap ever since they stopped her from sleeping in the sea. Luffy, should we get someone to go get him? Marco asked. Then regretted ever asking when the 6-year-old turned to him with evil in her eyes. Let him drown, she hissed before going back to nap, but changed her place to Pop's leg. They both stared at the little girl and vowed silently never to wake her up. For the first month Lucci was attacking her secretly and then did it openly. Some of the times Whitebeard got in the way, Most of the time Ace and Sabo protected their sister even if they knew she didn't need it, but what annoying Lucci the most was that said little girl was completely oblivious to the whole thing. Whether she was just dense or chose to ignore it just made things worse for him. Luffy was lying on the figurehead staring up at the sky and watched as Lucci had shadowed her face with his body. He was glaring down at her but her expression remained the same. "What does it take to kill you?" he asked in an emotionless voice. Luffy just stared up at the older boy and shrugged her shoulders and then went back to staring up at the sky. Lucci sat down next to the little girl, crossing his legs and thought about his mission. At this point failure was the only thing left, but he wasn't going to have that on his records. Spandam was just going to do things without him. Luffy stared at the agent from the corner of her eye and shifted her form so her head was on his lap and her body curled up into a ball in front of him. Marco, Ace, Sabo and Thatch were cracking themselves over the scene as they watched Lucci silently panic over the situation. Thatch turned his little brothers holding up a camera and then lead them onto the figurehead. Marco was going to object to the idea but gave up out of sheer laziness and curiosity. Thatch, Ace and Sabo were standing in front of Lucci and Luffy with large smiles plastered on their faces and did nothing to hide the camera. Lucci was internally screaming at the pirates and wanted to kill them and was just about to get up when the taller pirate interrupted his thoughts. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. You move and she throws you back into the sea and you'll find yourself on Fishman Island." Thatch held up the camera and the bright flash went off, but just as they expected, Luffy hit her brothers into the ocean with her tail. Thatch had Ace in his arm while the other was holding up the camera high above water to keep them both from drowning. Marco was leaning against the railing snickering at their stupidity. He was just glad he was off pillow duty and then returned to the deck. Whitebeard was once again drowning himself in alcohol, however, put it down when his son had walked up to him with the same face but knew that he wanted to talk to him. "Pops, we got 3 idiots who got themselves overboard, again." Whitebeard heard the curses that were coming from down below and then looked out in the direction of the figurehead. "I'm guessing someone else is on pillow duty. Who is it this time that got them overboard?" As Whitebeard and Marco discussed Thatch, Ace and Sabo's stubborn act of getting pictures of everyone who ever got pillow duty, the rest of the crew were getting them out of the water. Marco went back to snickering when the 3 were finally fished out. "I don't see why you keep getting yourselves tossed overboard. After 2 years of being on this ship I would think it reached through those thick head of yours." "No way. This is just as hilarious as when Luffy slept on Dayton in the Crazy Old Man. We've kept every picture and I'm not letting going to miss my chances for another one." Ace huffed triumphantly. Sabo could only shake his head at Ace's crazy antics, still not knowing why he kept tagging along, but it was also because he knew the real meaning behind the pictures. Their little sister wasn't going to be little for long and she was going to outlive them. They were going to make as many memories as they could while they still had the chance. Lucci was eating dinner with the rest of the crew since the brat he was trying to kill had dragged him there, but he didn't understand why she was sitting on his lap while they ate. "You're old enough to sit on your own seat, so get off me," he snarled. It didn't work. She just kept eating, pressing her back against his chest. Ace, being the protective brother he was, silently fuming while he watched the display before him, but forgot it when said sister stole a chunk of meat from his plate. "Oi, Luffy, you don't go stealing from your brother." Sabo just placed a hand on Ace's shoulder, seating the enraged man back in his seat. "Give it up, she's already stolen from Pops 15 times in the past half an hour." Even Whitebeard was a little surprised to hear that his youngest daughter got past him, but that was when he noticed a slight tail on its way to take more. Everyone had their eyes on her hands and didn't notice her extended limbs. Chuckling to himself, he grabbed the tiny tail and held her up to display, dangling her in his grasp. "Papa, no fair. Sabo, you traitor. You're not supposed to tell him." The commanders laughed as their youngest retracted her tail, plummeted onto their old man's lap and jumped straight back into eating her heart out. Lucci wondered how they could all laugh without a care in the world. The girl was a dangerous being and needed to be eliminated. The rest of the night went without anything happening. Lucci didn't try to assassinate Luffy for what seemed to be the 1000th time. Ace hadn't played any sort of prank on the crew. Sabo wasn't training, and Luffy was swimming around the bottom of the boat as she usually did before going to bed. It was a quiet night and everything seemed well. Each and every day was going to be an adventure. Shanks had decided to visit since he became good friends with Whitebeard's youngest and always needed an excuse to party. Not really. When they reached the giant of a ship, the crew hopped onto the deck. Whitebeard had a blank expression on his face when he saw his visitors. He wasn't going to enjoy where all of this was going to go. Whitebeard had his theories on why the fellow Yonko kept visiting, but kept it to himself. "Luffy, you've got visitors," Whitebeard called. Luffy sprinted her way through the halls, Lucci following close behind, with his attempts for the day. Luffy saw the straw-hatted captain and jumped into his arms, stuffing her face into his chest. "Hey, kiddo, how've you been?" "Good," Luffy cheered. She picked up his straw hat and made a dash for it. She loved it when Shanks visited. She would take his hat and never let it go until it was time for them to leave. Shanks watched the little girl run off once again with his hat and then turned his gaze to the man who followed her out. He definitely wasn't Ace or Sabo, so he gave a questionable look at Whitebeard to explain his purpose. This is Rob Lucci, he was sent to kill Luffy. Whitebeard tried to make it sound serious but had difficulty hiding the amusement in his voice every time the subject came up. Shanks on the other hand burst out laughing, clutching his stomach with one hand while the other patted Lucci on the back. You've got a tough job there, brat. So welcome to the family, you're going to be here for a long time. He sang, and then turned to his crew. This calls for a party. Luffy had returned to see the crews participating in another one of their celebrations. She spotted Shanks drowning himself in sake, clutching the beloved straw hat, and she sat in his lap. Shanks halted his drinking and saw the little girl, her eyelids slowly closing, with her head against his chest. Oh no, you don't. I'm not on pillow duty. I've gotten away from it for 2 years. Luffy, wake up. But it was too late, they had already gotten his picture, and the sound of something hitting the sea filled their ears, as the laughter broke out. The little girl finally got to the feared red-haired captain as her pillow and Ace had added another precious memory to the scrapbook. When it was time for Shanks to leave, he left his straw hat to Luffy. She promised to keep it safe for him and become a great pirate when she was older. There were going to be so many things the little girl had in store for them all. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is Daughter of the Sea by Kuchia-chi. Chapter 6, Not to be messed with. The New World wasn't supposed to be the type of place for children. After its immense bipolar weather and intensely strong pirates, marines and bounty hunters, many people wouldn't think that a little girl at the age of 6 would be swimming around at the bottom of the world's most famous pirate's boat. Luffy hadn't gone swimming in a long time, the naps were catching up with her. If she didn't sleep on the surface soon, she was going to be as bad as Ace. Honestly, she didn't want to be like Ace when it came those sorts of things. It meant that she would miss meals and, well, miss meals. Luffy swam deeper and deeper until she could only see the very bottom of the boat. A lot of the local sea kings had come to talk to her about all that had happened over the years. A lot of it had been about her mother and what she did over time. Some of the time Luffy fell asleep through the conversation until a large current hit. Obviously, her mother wasn't happy with the fact that her daughter wasn't paying attention to her life story. The current had swept Luffy a fair distance away from the ship, but she was very capable of navigating her way back without a log pose. She spotted a different type of ship up on the surface and decided to investigate. They were headed in the direction of the Moby Dick, so she was sure that they would give her a lift. Changing her legs to a tail, Luffy had began swimming up to the ship. As she broke the surface, she noticed the pirate flag that was waving in the harsh winds. Oi, the tiny girl called up. Can I have a lift? The pirate crew had already been leaning against the railing to prevent their belongings from falling overboard and noticed the girl. They thought that she was crazy to be swimming the waters of the New World. There were sea kings and so many sudden changes in the current that it would only take a second and bam, dead. Oi, Captain, there's a girl in the ocean and she wants a lift. One of the crewmates called. The captain had left his quarters to look down at the little girl with black hair, a scar under her left eye and a red shirt, but what had caught his attention when he had looked close enough was the ruby red tail that was swatting around under the waves. A greedy look intently came over the captain's already hideous face. All he had to do was get her onto his boat and he could sell her at the slave auction. With a tail like that, anyone would be willing to pay millions, maybe billions for her. Can I get a lift? Luffy called again. Sure, the captain cooed. We're one of the best pirates around and just about to defeat the strongest man alive. Luffy honestly wondered who on earth he could have been talking about. She hadn't heard of the strongest man alive, not that she really cared in the first place. She just flicked her tail rather hard and propelled herself on the deck of the rather large pirate ship. It didn't look like any of the ones that were allied with her father, but they were pirates nonetheless and went along with it. Just before Luffy landed on the deck, she changed her tail back into legs. She pulled all the traces of salt water off her body and threw back into the sea. She wasn't too keen on taking baths, not matter how many times the nurses had attempted to persuade her into doing so. That's a neat little trick you got there, girlie. Luffy had turned her head back to the captain, who was looking at her with drool hanging from his mouth. Mind telling us what you are? I'm the daughter of the sea. She bluntly replied. The captain only wanted a title to call her by when he sold her. He didn't care whatever else had to come. He, apparently, was going to kill the mighty Whitebeard and take his position as Yonko, and then he could move on to being king of the pirates. The captain had ordered his crew to continue their course faster and show the little girl just how strong they were and the amount of money they were going to make. Luffy didn't care what the hell was going on around her as long as they were head in the direction of the Moby Dick. She was just going to lay around and wait. The crew had tempted to sway her with gifts and smooth words, though they went through one ear and out the other. Luffy was just excited to get back home. She had been listening to the Sea Kings talk about her mother for hours on end, and now that she was on the ship it was starting to get dark. By the time they had made it to the Moby Dick, the crew were using grappling hooks to get up the side of the more than massive ship. While Luffy had jumped her way up, she had done it more than once to know how high the railing of the Moby Dick was. The pirate crew she came with had gawked at the little girl who had the power step of a monster to just leap onto the ship without a care. The captain, being the egotistic prick he was, had immediately though that the girl was fighting for them. Luffy had made her way to her father's room, opened the giant door, climbed onto the bed and onto the man chest. She sat there, cross-legged until the man had woken up. "Luffy, I'm glad that you're back," Whitebeard claimed. He was still a little groggy from being woken up, he didn't know what the time was but it wasn't a wise time. "How did you get on the boat without the night watch calling?" His daughter just shrugged her shoulders, she didn't know who was on night shift, as long as it wasn't her then she was good. "I'm guessing that you came with company." "Yeah, they're really weird. They kept going on and on about how they're going to kill the strongest man alive, whoever that is." Gururara, no kidding, he wondered how much Luffy had actually listened when she was given information about the world around her. "How about we go meet these friends of yours? Go get Marco, I'm sure he's plucking feathers right now." "Okay," Luffy chirped, sliding off the large man's chest and ran out the door, saw the other pirates with swords drawn and guns cocked at the girl and then ran into one of the practically long hallways to find Marco's room. Luffy wasn't the type to knock unless in the company of strangers. Sabo's lessons on manners were getting tiring and soon made their way into her head. Luffy busted into the room like a ninja and jumped onto Marco. It almost gave the poor man a heart attack. If it was anyone else other than Luffy he would have wrung their necks in more ways than one. "Luffy, where the hell have you been?" Marco growled. No matter how threatening he thought he sounded, Luffy knew that there was more concern in his voice than anything else. "I came back with friends and Papa wants you to meet them." Even though he had just been woken up by a hyperactive girl in the middle of the night, he was still capable of piece two and two together. Marco got up, grabbed his shirt and shoes since he sleeps in his shorts. "Luffy, why don't you get your brothers, while I wake everyone else up? I'm sure everyone wants to meet these friends of yours." Marco also wondered why the night guard hadn't informed them of the incoming ship, but then pushed it aside to wake up the rest of the commanders. He watched as the little girl had happily trotted out of the door and down to her room, that she shared with Ace and Sabo. It didn't take long for the crew to assemble on the deck and face off the pirates. When Ace and Sabo had joined in on the deck, with Luffy close behind them they watched the battle unfold. The boys were quick on their feet to join in but Luffy stayed on the side, feeling the sleepiness washed over her but just watched the battle commence. She saw the ugly captain shoot a quick glance at her and then started to yell something. "You," he hissed, "you're the one who called them. Didn't you?" He pushed back the ran he was fighting and made his way towards the girl, who was swinging her legs over the railing. Luffy stared at the man with a blank expression, she didn't know what that captain man was going on about. Of course she called them, they're her family. "Yeah," Luffy said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. This had rubbed the captain the wrong way. "I'm going to take you to the slave markets and get you for a hefty price and there isn't a damn thing you can do about it," the captain yelled. There was a cold chill through the air when the Whitebeard pirates heard that their youngest was going to be sold off. This had invoked a bad reaction from her elder brothers. Ace was in the middle of battling some lower pirates, while Sabo had just finished his set and jumped in between Luffy and the enraged captain on the unknown pirate fleet. "You're not taking our sister anywhere until you get through us first," Sabo announced. He already had his lead pipe in his hand, he could have used a sword but not many people can cut through a hockey-infused pipe. Sabo had done some immense training, he had to take responsibilities as the eldest and since they were in the new world, it was difficult to survive without it. Sabo had picked up on hockey rather quickly despite only being 13. The captain had drew out a sword and fought against the top-hatted boy. Luffy had jumped off the railing in concern for her brother, she hadn't seen the captain fight until just now and was beating Sabo but before Luffy could interview, the sword just slipped past the pipe and sliced from Sabo's right shoulder blade to his left hip, it didn't seem deep enough to leave a scar. However, Luffy's reaction to all of this was worse than the Whitebeard pirates, when they heard their sister was going to be sold. The sea around them had become unbelievably violent and the chill in the air had almost dropped to the negatives. A single step from the 6-year-old had stopped the battle on both sides. Whitebeard sat down when he saw his youngest in such a state, there wasn't much that got this sort of reaction. It was probably Shank's influence that had changed her view on things. The Whitebeard pirates had taken a step back, to avoid getting into the soon-to-be messy crossfire. "Oi, Luffy, it's only a little cut, I'll be fine. No need to get upset." Sabo despite his words had also drawn back and watched his sister from a safe distance. Luffy had lunged at the pirate captain, he had lowered his sword to damage the girl a bit, he was still planning on selling her, even though he saw the reaction the other pirates had to the girl. "No one hurts my family and gets away with it." He watched as the sword went straight through the girl without a hint of damage, however, he had gotten too close to her neck and the necklace dropped to the deck. Even though the waves were wild around them, they could hear a pin drop. This wasn't a good sign. Luffy had changed into her fully grown form, serpent tail coiling around the hull of the Moby Dick, large claws digging into the deck of the ship and the opposing pirates had pissed themselves. They had tried to get back to the ship but it was smashed to nothing with a swat of a tail and the pirates were thrown halfway across the new world and later eaten by sea kings. It had been a long night but the sun had broken through the horizon as Luffy had claimed her place on Whitebeard's lap. The whole crew had seen Luffy in that form at least once or twice, but up close was new to them. They watched Luffy had pulled a cracker out of nowhere and started nibbling on it. Whitebeard had patted the girl on the head affectionately and then burst out laughing. "Gururara, it's hard not to love her, isn't it?" Whitebeard laughed and soon the crew joined in. Others had left to make breakfast. They were going to have a party about their early morning victory, and Luffy most likely didn't eat much if nibbling on that cracker she found. Nobody ever found out about the night guards, but one odd little character who happened to be from the government had knocked out the night watch when he saw the little girl sail in on the incoming boat. He had to do some investigating on the girl's fighting technique but had received nothing of the sort in the end. He wondered why he was still there on the boat in the first place. Chapter 7, Valentine's Day. Whitebeard was proudly lounging around in his chair as he watched his sons do all the grunt work. There was a small explosion below deck, but that was to be expected. His two youngest sons were always causing trouble. But something was off. It was only till he had picked up his sake bottle and pressed it to his lips that he knew what it was. The nurses were missing. They weren't harping at him for the first in what seemed like forever. Marco had finished his job and went to accompany his father, and who had quizzical look on his face as he stared into the empty air. This didn't happen very often. Actually, Marco didn't think it happened at all. "What's up, Pops? You look like you've been staring at the air for hours." "Gururara, it's nothing to worry about. Have you seen Luffy around?" Marco wondered what was going on. Pops barely asks where his daughter was unless it was something important. He had mainly talked to Ace and Sabo about their destruction that they caused on the ship. "That explosion wasn't her fault today, you know, right?" "Of course I know. Are you doubting me?" "No, Pops, but I haven't seen Luffy around then." "Why?" "No reason." Marco could see the faintest sign of a smirk on Whitebeard's lips. He wasn't going to go through all the trouble of finding the answer. If Pops wasn't going to tell him, it meant it was going to turn up sooner or later, maybe. Marco just sighed and walked away. There was still a lot of other things to do on the ship and didn't want to worry about whatever the captain had in mind. Below the decks, the nurses were attempting to explain the purpose of Valentine's Day to the 6-year-old, who didn't even know the day existed until now. They had sat Luffy down and went through all the detailing, until Haruta just summed up the whole day in a couple of words. "Luffy, Valentine's Day is a day where you give chocolates to the person or people you love." So it's a mystery day. The group sighed in defeat. Obviously the girl didn't know the meaning of love meant. It was going to be a long Valentine's. The women on the ship never got the chance to do Valentine's Day because of all the pirate that attacked on that day. Apparently a lot of pirates from other crews wanted the nurses and attacked. However, since Luffy had interrupted last year's Valentine's, they were finally able to celebrate the one day without the means of a pirate attack. "Luffy, you like everyone on the ship, right?" Haruta was going to give the explanation another crack, but from a slightly different angle. "Yeah." Luffy didn't know why the commander asked. "She cared for everyone on the ship." "Then you want to show them how you care, right?" This time she nodded. A little part of her told her to run away, but the curiosity inside was too much for her to handle and wriggled in her seat. "Valentine's Day is when you do that, by making chocolate for everyone. So I can make chocolates for Papa and Marco ni and Ace ni and Sabo ni and Thatch ni and..." Luffy had to get cut off by the nurses or she would have listed the names of everyone on the ship. "Yes, do you want to help?" Luffy frantically nodded her head in excitement. It was a day of appreciation and she was going to do everything in her power to make it the best Valentine's Day ever. Oh dear lord, what have I done?" Ace sat on the figurehead of the Moby Dick. He hadn't seen Luffy all day since the nurses had ran off with her and dragged her into the great unknown. He vowed that he would be patient. He wasn't going to interrupt the possible attempt to make Luffy into a lady. As the day ticked by and there wasn't a sound around him, Ace had gotten up and went in search of Sabo for some answers. If anything that he didn't understand, then Sabo had the answers to it. Ace found his older brother in the middle of sparring with Vista. He had heard Sabo asking for tips along the way. Vista had defeated the boy numerous amount of time, but his determination had inspired him to teach him the ways of the sword. Vista tried to convince the young gentleman into using a sword, but he had claimed that it just wouldn't feel right if it wasn't his pipe. When the fight was over, Sabo was huffing and puffing but straightened himself up rather quickly. He turned to Ace. He had known he was there since the second he started watching, but he had to keep his guard up and ignored him till he had finished. "If you're looking for Luffy, the nurses had dragged her to the kitchen and they haven't left the whole day." Sabo couldn't help but smirk. He knew it was Valentine's Day and so did Vista. Sabo didn't know why, but a part of him was screaming that Vista was the reason Valentine's Day was invented. On the very day, there was a change in the man's movement. He would tweak his mustache all day and a sly smirk on his lips plastered on his lips. It honestly sent shivers down his spine. Sabo didn't trust that smirk. Ever. Why would she be in the kitchen? The chefs won't give her anything no matter how much she pulls. That face. I swear to whatever god there is, those chefs have a heart of stone. I've never thought I'd see the day that someone turned down the face. Ace could help but feel himself being questioned on his intelligence with the looks that he was getting the men in front of him. He obviously wasn't going to be getting any answers from them and left in a huff. It was going to be a very long day. Luffy had raided the kitchen for all the chocolate that was stocked up from the last island and dropped it all over the counter in front of the nurses and the female chefs. The 6-year-old wanted everything to be perfect, which meant listening to her superiors for once and do exactly what they told her to do. First we have to melt the chocolate down so we can shape it, the head nurse announced. The chefs had lit the stoves and began digging out for metal bowls to hold the delicate sweet. Luffy watched in amazement at how fast everything went about, the swift movements of the whisks, the cooling, the reheating and everything in between. Luffy had finally made all of her, over 1,000, chocolates. Most of them were in a small blob-like shape. Every chocolate was equally made despite the shape that they came in. The nurses had their concerns with the girl's sweet, but once one of them had tasted it, they had deemed it rather eatable and maybe non-hazardous. The pirates on the Moby Dick adored Valentine's Day. It wasn't a matter of love, but it was more viewed by the men as a competition. If they were lucky enough to finish whatever pirate ship had came early and the game had commenced. The nurses didn't know about the whole inside game that was made by the crew, but it was always a challenge. First place, every other year and more than likely that year as well, was Whitebeard. Second place always varied. Ever since the siblings boarded, the game was put on hold.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
Luffy had finally stuck the final little ribbon on her neatly wrapped chocolates and tossed it into the pile with the rest. The nurses had went ahead of her to give theirs out, so by the time she had finally made her way out, Luffy was jumping up and down on the tips of her feet. This was a very exciting day of the year that she was going to treasure. Her first stop was her father. She went to the deck with the large bag filled with small chocolates. He wasn't in his throne, most likely since that was, like the only day the nurses got the old man the day off, and Whitebeard was fine with that. Luffy made her way to the giant's room and knocked on the door. Come in. Luffy popped her tiny head through a crack in the door and saw her father reading one of the maps, most likely the one of the next island. Ah, Luffy, we haven't seen you all day. How can I help you? Luffy came in, the massive bag behind her. Whitebeard could take an easy guess and waited till his youngest had made her move. Luffy shuffled uncomfortably on her feet and then dived into the bag, pulling out a green tin-foiled chocolate with a small blue stick-on ribbon. It was about the size of her tiny palm, but she had put every bit of love into each and every one. Luffy held up the nicely colored chocolate up to her father. Happy Valentine's Day, Papa. Gururara, is that for me? Thank you, Luffy. He patted the girl on the head, which made her grin a toothy grin, and took the tiny chocolate in his hand. Now I'm guessing that bag over there had everyone else's. Yep, it has Marco knees and Ace knees and Sabo knees, but was cut short once again, but this time Whitebeard had patted the girl on the head again. Excellent, but Valentine's doesn't last forever, so why not go out and give them their chocolates before it's too late? Luffy nodded and ran out of the door, once again dragging the bag behind her. Whitebeard chuckled lightly as he gently placed the small piece of chocolate on the large desk alongside all of the others that he had graciously received. Luffy's had handed out her chocolates with every pirate that passed, and by the time she found Ace and Sabo, her bag was almost empty and soon discarded for a small one. Her brothers were sparring for what seemed like forever, but stopped instantly when Luffy walked in. Hey Luffy, what do you have there? Sabo greeted. His eyes softly stared at his little sister and then trailed to the pouch in her tiny hands. Aces also stared at the suspicious bag and then made his way next to Sabo. He watched impatiently as Luffy had stuck her hand into the bag and pulled out two neatly wrapped and colored tin-foiled blobs with tiny ribbons on them. Ace mirrored Sabo as he gently picked up the tiny blob in her hands and then turned his attention back to Luffy. Happy Valentine's Day, Ace ni, Sabo ni. Luffy cheered. She was so proud of herself, for what she had done for them and the other members of her extensively large family. Ace stared down at the little tin-foil blob and tore a little piece off to reveal the mess of white and dark chocolate on the inside. His vision went back to his adorable little sister and hugged her at the same time as Sabo. Thanks, Luffy. They cheered in unison. They were proud of their little sister, and it definitely wasn't a fact that they were going to deny. They released her and walked out to the dining room where the day was spent in pure and absolute bliss. Ace and Sabo were going to enjoy the holiday to the fullest, along with everyone else. The crewmates were overjoyed when they got their chocolates from their youngest, and others were lucky to strike something with some of the nurses. That year, without a doubt the winner of the males' little game, had turned out to be the two youngest boys on the ship. Ace and Sabo were flooded with neatly wrapped chocolates. They were apparently the nurses' favorites with their charm. Ace didn't deny a thing, though Sabo had tried to comfort the pride-stricken men. It really was the best Valentine's Day they had in a long time. Chapter 8, Dawn Island and Marineford. The Whitebeard pirates were docked at one of their islands that they had placed under their protection. They were welcomed with open arms and assisted them with anything that they needed. Some of the villagers wanted to meet up with Whitebeard and thank him once again for his protection, but when he walked off the ship, what they weren't expecting was a 8-year-old girl to be sitting on his broad shoulders, devouring a bag of crackers. Papa, these people are weird. Luffy giggled, pointing a finger at the villagers. Whitebeard lightly pinched the girl's cheek and scolded her not to point at people, and what she said was rude. But it's true, just look. This time she waved her whole hand through the air. Why don't you play with your brothers? Whitebeard asked. They ran off ahead of me and told me to stay on the ship since it's too dangerous. Luffy scoffed. She was capable of taking care of herself. The only thing she had trouble with was getting lost on land, though she wasn't going to easily admit that. A panicking crewmate was sprinting down the gangplank with a den mushi in his hands and made his way to Whitebeard. The man had heard his son's distress and turned around, and both his and Luffy's eyes were on the snail in the panicked man's hands. Pops, there's a call from the East Blue about some pirates taking Kuchia village under their control. Our ships aren't fast enough to make it there in time. What are we going to do? The man asked frantically. Luffy stiffened in her place and clasped her father's coat in her fist. No one was going to attack her hometown without a fight. Calm down first, Whitebeard ordered. Are the pirates on the den mushi? The man nodded and placed the snail in his captain's hands. He glared at the poor snail before answering. What do you want, brats? Whitebeard really wasn't appreciating his islands being placed under attack, especially if it has anything to do with his youngest. Voices could be heard in the background. Some of the voices were cursing about the fact that Whitebeard had actually been protecting the island and they were going to get themselves all killed. One man, most likely the leader of the pirates, had picked up the receiver and began talking with an annoying sneer in his voice. Whitebeard, the boss started. I want to make a deal with you, since none of your ship can make it to the East Blue in the amount of time I'm asking for. I want all of the treasure that you have on board and send it to me for the lives of the villagers. Whitebeard might have been old, but he wasn't stupid, and he had met a lot of cocky pirates over the years. But this person seemed to have topped the cake, since rumors were fast to spread around the sea, but it was a fact that no one messed with the East Blue. No matter how many times it had went around the world, there was always one person, every year, that was possibly denser than Luffy to attack the East Blue. My ships might not make it, Whitebeard started. But I will send someone. You'll have to send a fleet to stop me. The pirate laughed. What's your name, brat? He didn't have time to bother with egotistic brats such as whoever was on the other end of the snail. Blue Jam. Luffy hissed at the name. She thought that Ace and Dayton had defeated him for good and went to prison, but apparently they still had some bite in him and now had a fight with the deity of the sea. Luffy snatched the receiver from Whitebeard's hand and pressed it to her lips. I'm on my way, you asshole. Slamming the den mushi down. She got up and dived into the sea from Whitebeard's shoulder and torpedoed through the water. Whitebeard watched his daughter go and then turned to his crew with a cold glare. Who taught her to speak like that? Luffy had changed into her serpent form and had already crossed through the calm belt and was already half an hour away from Dawn Island. Rage was fueling her speed and nothing was going to stop her until she had Blue Jam's head on a pike. The Sea Kings, who had saw the girl, quickly moved out of her way. Luffy might not be a murderer to her kind, but if she was angry, then they didn't want to be the ones to stop her. Luffy reached Dawn Island and shot out of the water. What she saw was her worst nightmare. All the villagers were tied up. The mayor, Makino, and even the nice fisherman were all tied up. The pirates had guns and swords already drawn, and their eyes were on the girl who was standing on the pier glaring at the pirates. I've come in place of Whitebeard. She wasn't going to put up with shit. If they wanted her father, they had to go through her first. Luffy's glare was on Blue Jam, who walked confidently over to her, sword in hand. He obviously didn't remember who she was. The infamous Whitebeard sent a girl to take me out. I said to bring a fleet. He pointed the sword an inch away from her neck, but she still glared from under her straw hat. But before Blue Jam could even blink, Luffy had slid out from under the blade and punched Blue Jam square in the face. You stupid brat, now they're going to die. One of the other pirates yelled and then signaled the men to follow. Don't touch them. The moment of her scream, a burst of haki had knocked out the pirates but left the villagers unharmed. Most had stared in amazement at Luffy and others stared in horror at the defenseless girl. She had knocked out at least 20 to 30 pirates at once without even moving. Blue Jam recovered from his sudden injury and noticed his collapsed colleges and glowered at the girl with the straw hat. Then a single memory resurfaced. You're that brat, Ace's little sister. You're still a hefty $1 when I sell you to the noble as a pet. Luffy shot out at the pirate again and began to beat him to a blood pulp. Blue Jam had taken a swing of his sword at the girl but was utterly horrified when his weapon had passed right through her, water splattering the air and the wound healing instantaneously. This time Luffy had covered her fist in her ruby red scales and knocked the man right out. She wasn't done with him until she knew that he wasn't coming back. She dropped Blue Jam on the ground for the time being and clawed the ropes off of the villagers. Makino had hugged the 8-year-old the moment she was freed. Thank you, Luffy. It must have been so scary for you to see us like this. I'm just happy that you're all safe, but I have to visit Ji-chan so I know this guy never comes back. Luffy forced a smile to reassure her mother figure. Plus Sabo, Ace and I are going to be back for a visit when we start our own crew. So we'll meet again, promise. She gave a peck on the cheek before she left Kuchia village with all of the pirates tied up and dragged through the sea towards Marineford. Marineford was a busy, hustle and bustle type of city, and because it was a marine base that was guarded with the gates of justice, getting in, let alone seeing pirates, was an unusual thing to see. So when Luffy had come out of the water with a rope that tied up 30 pirates and a sea king that looked like it had attempted to eat the pirates, there was definitely a large panic. Marines had soon flooded the place, warning the girl to back down with whatever she was doing. Luffy shot eyes down the Marines' backs with a single glance. "Where's Ji-chan? I have something to say to him." Sengoku was watching the whole ordeal from his office with a pair of binoculars. He felt a smirk making his way onto his lips. Even though the girl was being raised on an infamous pirate ship, he wasn't going to stop the sea deity from beating the crap out of Garp. He turned to talk to Garp, who was once again making himself too comfortable in his office. "Garp," Sengoku growled. Garp looked at him and raised an eyebrow. The smirk was now visible, and this made the marine hero worried. "Your granddaughter's here to see you, and she's got a batch of pirates and a sea king tied to a rope. This can't be good," Garp muttered before going back to whatever the hell he found and ate it. "I also got a report saying that Dawn Island, though it's under Whitebeard's protection, was under attack and pirates had taken hostages from Kuchia village." Garp choked on his food before slamming through the walls, sprinting through the hallways to find a place to hide. He knew how scary his granddaughter was when she didn't like something. She had a heart of gold, but when something happened to someone precious to her, Luffy would hunt them down and possibly murder whoever it was, if it wasn't for her young age and disciplining. Luffy had taken down the Marines easy and made her way to headquarters. The admirals had heard of the devil girl who was dragging a load pirates through the town and went to take a look. Aokiji, Akainu and Kizaru towered over the bite-sized shrimp. They all wondered how a little girl had taken down so many Marines in such a short matter of time. Kizaru was the first to comment. "Miss, we can take that off your hands, you know." Luffy had to pull her straw hat back to look up at the admirals. She frowned. This wasn't going to be easy. "No can do. I have to talk to Ji-chan and give him a piece of my mind." Aokiji was then next to step forward. His curiosity was just as overwhelming as his fellow admiral, but he was going to get some straight answers. "Who's your grandfather?" Akainu felt he was surrounded by nothing but idiots. It was obvious that the girl had taken down a load of Marines, and that was a declaration of war. Not only that, but she had the guts to walk right into Marine headquarters demanding to see her grandfather with a load of pirates behind her. Before Luffy could answer, the large man in a red suit had shot up to her and punched her from the head down. Her body reformed from the punch, and when the admiral had tired again and again at his attempts to knock her down, he only to get a scale red tail to the face. Akainu was sent flying into some buildings and stayed down for the moment to collect his thoughts. "Will you stop that?" Luffy growled. She was still on her mission. Aokiji had frozen the girl and shattered her, but wasn't expecting the girl to reform once again. That was when the fleet admiral had come up behind them and ordered them to stop. "It is needless to fight the girl. It is impossible for the time being. There is no need to fight over something so trivial," Sengoku announced. He stared down at the straw-hatted girl and noticed she was eyeing his hat and afro. He smiled down at the girl and then stood to the side to show her the way to headquarters. "Luffy, looking for a fight as always. That stupid grandfather of yours is currently hiding from you, but I'm sure you'd like to find him. You have my permission to hunt down Garp, so long as you don't destroy headquarters. We'll take those pirates off your hands." Luffy smiled for the first time since she landed on the island. It was good to see Sengoku, since he had personally taken care of all of the previous Dawn Island incidents and knew the girl over time. He was happy with her pirate deliveries, but still wasn't too keen on Garp's idea on leaving her with Whitebeard. Luffy handed the rope over to the fleet admiral. "Thanks, Afro Awesome." Once her hands were free, Luffy began walking towards Marine headquarters, cracking her knuckles. "Ji-chan." Her voice had sent chills down everyone's backs. They pitied the marine hero to have such a devilish granddaughter. Then again, it was also his son's fault for taking in the girl when she was born before dropping her off at Dawn Island. The admirals demanded a full explanation from Sengoku, but just told the Marines to take the Blue Jam pirates to level 6 of Impel Down. If it were any other level, Luffy would have had his head. Sometimes he thought that they might need a new level at Impel Down just for the petite girl's victims. A faint cry could be heard from the marine hero before Luffy had left to return to Whitebeard's ship. The next day, the front page of the newspaper was of a sea demon in the form of a little girl, who had attacked Marineford head-on, by herself and Wan. Any further information had been cut off by the world government, but the Whitebeard pirates still got a good laugh. Chapter 9, Birthday Blitz. It all happened one day. The wheels of happening had started to turn, but it seemed all like a coincidence. It wasn't an ordinary day at that. It was one little 8-year-old's birthday. She had forgotten it every other year, and that year wasn't any more special. Luffy had still wandered around the ship, completely oblivious to the suspicious movements around the Moby Dick. Only until one of the nurses had shown her a frilly red dress and told her to wear it for the day did Luffy show a sign of horror. The little 8-year-old was running like her life depended on it. Luffy ran up the stairs from the lower deck, the nurses and Ace close behind her. She sprinted towards her father, since he was the only safe place on the ship, where she could get away and rest in peace. Once Whitebeard was in sight, Luffy had leapt onto his pants and made her way up onto his lap. No matter how old she got, the elder man never complained once about having his daughter rest on him. He was actually quite happy with the way Luffy treated him and always happily called him her father in the brightest way. Luffy gripped the fabric in her hands and was just about to pull herself up when a pair of hands had gripped her waist and ripped her right off. She turned around to see Ace smirking at her attempts to escape. "Ace, put me down. I don't want to wear the dress. It's stupid," she screamed, flailing her arms and legs around in the air like there was no tomorrow. "Sorry, Luffy, but you're wearing the dress whether you like it or not." Ace turned around and gave her to the nurses, who then tied up the poor girl and stormed away in a dust storm. Ace turned to Whitebeard, did a slight bow before chasing after the nurses. Whitebeard only smiled at the sight and caught the gaze of his second youngest son giggling, while he watched the whole scene play out before him. Sabo noticed Pop's gaze, tipped his hat politely before getting up to follow his siblings to the lower decks. Ace was waiting against the wall, eyeing the door that held the nurses, Haruta and one over-eccentric Luffy. He heard footsteps coming from the other direction and watched as Sabo had taken his place next to him, also watching the door in anticipation. It was going to be a long day if other pirates attacked. Shanks might make it for the girl's birthday party, but with his current location in the Marines, he'd be lucky to make it on the same week. The door finally opened and out came Luffy with the dress finally on her small form and tackled Ace square in the hips. Luffy was too short for her age. She tilted her head up and stared Ace dead in the eyes with the biggest puppy dog face and lightly whimpered. "Ace, do I have to wear the dress?" He could feel himself breaking on the inside. Ace quickly shot a glance at Sabo, who was already on the floor laughing his ass off. He was about to shout at him until he felt the fabric of his pants twist. He turned his attention back to Luffy, who was started to tear up with the condition that she was in. Ace bit his lip. He had to restrain himself from her. Lucky for him, Sabo had stopped his laughing fit and picked Luffy up, resting her on his waist. Luffy's arms curled around her brother's neck as he picked her up. She had dropped the puppy dog face since it never worked on Sabo in the first place, but she still complained as they walked through the hallways. Lucci was strolling in the other direction and nodded briefly before continuing. Luffy's birthday was the only day that he hadn't attempted to assassinate the poor girl. It was nice of him to do so, though Sabo suspected he didn't attempted to being killed on her birthday, mainly because he would have had his back snapped in two if he did try anything. Luffy stopped shuffling around. "It's hard to carry you. Then let me take the stupid thing off. It itches." "That's not going to happen." "Then put me down. You'll just run off to get changed and I'm not going to let that happen either." The argument could be heard all over the ship. Sabo and Luffy were arguing the moment that they took a step in any direction. They had finally made it to the deck. It was filled with streamers and the dining tables were moved out onto the deck. The tables were covered in every inch with food and the largest table in the middle contained the 9-tier cake. The cake tiers always got bigger with every year. With the way the girl was growing in her stomach, it had to get bigger. Then there was her brothers and Teach. Some thought that there were too many Ds on the boat for their own good. "Happy birthday, Luffy." The crowd cheered. Sabo put down Luffy. Once she was on the ground, she clasped a hand onto Sabo's blue coat. She stared at the crowd in disbelief and then to her brother and back to the crowd. A large smile grew on her face, and then she remembered all of the other years that she had her birthday. Each and every one were different in a very special way. "Thank you, everyone." They all dived into the party, drinks were shared around, and the most entertaining thing the Whitebeard crew had ever saw was when Luffy had climb up Pop's coat and onto his shoulders so she could strap a party hat to his head. Once again Luffy had entertained herself for the whole night, with all the ridiculous games and eating. Thatch had a hat on the very tip of his hairdo that seemed like it made the girl laugh for hours, only to be topped when she gave Marco a pineapple in a dress for his birthday. Everyone was happy with the party, only until the next day did an uncertain and uneasy silence had gave the crew some sort of suspicions. It was quieter than their normal day. It was an uneasy feeling that they couldn't quite put their finger on. Only until Luffy had wandered up onto the deck did they notice what was the matter. "Hey Luffy," one of the crewmates shouted. "Where's Shadow?" Luffy turned around a couple times before shrugging her shoulders. Lucci followed her around each and every day that the crew called him Shadow. Luffy wasn't too hung up on the government agent's presence and continued what she did best, sitting on her father. Whitebeard was also curious as to the whereabouts of the government agent, though he had suspected that he had been called to another mission and left the ship and would return as soon as it was completed. Luffy swung her legs back and forth, thinking about her little plan that she wanted to go through with, but she knew that her family wouldn't let her go so easily. But since Lucci wasn't there to keep her in place, Luffy knew that it was time for her to have her own adventures. The next day the Whitebeard pirates were in another panic. Luffy had disappeared from the ship and any signs of her current location were gone. Marco had kept a level head about the whole situation, though it was difficult for him. A crudely written note was on the main mast and he plucked it off. "Hey everyone, I'm going on a trip to the other blues. I don't know how long I'm going to be, but I'll call you to pick me at Sabayati when I'm done. Thanks, Luffy." Marco growled under his breath and holding back every urge in his body not to crush the note. His wait event was to take the note to Pops and let him deal with the situation. The letter was given to Whitebeard, where he read it aloud for his crew to hear. The crew didn't know whether sigh with relief that Luffy wasn't missing or stolen or something they didn't want to imagine. Her note was going to cause a lot of trouble for the people around the world, but that was going to be Luffy's problem. She could take care of herself, as long as she didn't get a bounty, they guess they could allow it. Maybe. Chapter 10, East Blue Part 1. Luffy was happily swimming towards the East Blue in her half-serpent form. Even though she had never left her home island before she met Whitebeard, she was really looking forward to visiting her old home sea. It was considered the weakest, but it was the calmest of them all. It's just had that special touch to it that Luffy loved. The Sea Kings that she passed had greeted her and wished her a safe trip. Luffy had crossed the clam belt since it was a lot faster than going through the red line. Luffy couldn't contain her excitement and soon found herself all over the place. The Sea Kings had to direct the small girl to her determined location. The local Sea King of Dawn Island had easily heard about his old friend returning to the sea and left his post to greet her. Luffy had entered the East Blue border and watched as Ko had swum towards her at high speed. If it was any normal person, they would have been scared witless. However, in Luffy's case, she only gave a toothy grin as the serpent coiled its long leather brown body around the petite girl and squeezed her tightly. "I've missed you so much, Ko." Luffy cheered, her head pressed against the Sea King's stomach. "I've also missed you, Luffy-sama. You've grown so much over the years." Luffy flapped her tail around frantically to signal the old friend to release her. Ko had gotten a good look, the 9-year-old girl in mermaid form. She was incredibly cute, and no doubt that when she got older she could rival Boa Hancock. She wasn't a god for nothing. "Ko, I'm on my own little adventure right now. I'll be visiting the islands around every sea and then return to Papa." Luffy explained. "Will you be my escort?" The Sea King bowed its head before replying in a rather friendly yet sarcastic voice. "Would there be any other?" Luffy only laughed. She changed back to her human form and sat on Ko's head as he gracefully swam to the closest island. He had explained the island's history, but the tiny deity had fallen asleep the moment he started talking. Ko could only laugh at his master's actions. On the Moby Dick, it had only been a couple of hours since Luffy's absence on the Moby Dick was officially announced, and the girls' brothers weren't taking it too well. Sabo had been working on his pipe, while Ace was pacing the concentration out of all of the members of the crew. "Ace, will you stop pacing already?" Thatch growled. He was worried about the girls being as well, but he wasn't going around driving the crew insane with annoying movements. "If you're so worried about her, then just go after her." Thatch thought about what he had just said, then continued. "But if she sends you flying, don't say we didn't warn you." Ace stared at the 4th Division commander and then grabbed Sabo. He ran down to the lower decks to launch his fire-powered boat. The pace Ace was moving at was too fast for even Sabo to register what had happened to him. First he was been repairing his pipe, and the next thing he knew he was on the striker with Ace heading to the East Blue. He had to make a note that Ace was going to be the death of him if he didn't learn to channel his complex. Getting to the East Blue was easy, it was finding Luffy that was going to be the problem. Luffy had told Ko how she wasn't going to visit Dawn Island, because seeing everyone without a purpose meant that she was staying for a while, and she didn't want that to happen. Luffy wasn't as stupid as most people thought. She knew that Ace and Sabo would be coming to get her, and their first stop would be Dawn Island. The Sea King had taken her to the next closest island to Dawn, and by the time they had reached it, it was already mid-afternoon. The town was rather quiet despite its size. It was located in the Ina Valley area. Luffy could see a dojo on the edge of the village, and that was going to be an interesting place to start her little exploration. Ko had dropped off Luffy at the docks and was lucky that the place was empty. Luffy didn't seem to care whether anyone saw them or not and went straight towards the dojo at the top of the hill. When Luffy had gotten there, she immediately noticed the large bamboo fence and climbed up to see what was on the other side. She saw boys around the same age as her. Luffy had to adjust her straw hat to see further and noticed a lone green-haired teen around the age of 13 lifting a boulder, doing squats at the edge of the cliff. She found the boy intriguing. He had ambition about him. An interesting character indeed. Luffy leapt over the fencing, ignoring the blushing stares, and headed straight towards the green-haired teen. She stood directly in front of him, since she doubted that he would acknowledge anyone outside his field of vision. "What do you want?" he growled. He was in the middle of training and didn't have time to deal with little kids. Luffy only smiled. She like him, he was strong but not as strong as her brothers and sisters. "What's your dream?" Luffy asked, completely ignoring the teen's treat. "Why should I tell you? What ambition drives you to be the best?" She wondered aloud. Her questions were pushing the teen over the edge. Luffy watched as he had set down the boulder and sat down, legs crossed, and stared at her with a cold glare. "What do you want?" This time his voice wasn't a treat but an invitation to continue. "What's your name?" "I'm Monkey D. Luffy." Luffy answered cheerfully. Once again she had won the verbal war, like she had done with her father 5 years ago. It was a cherished memory of hers, which she never wanted to forget. "Roronoa Zoro. What's your dream?" Luffy asked again. She watched as Zoro had gotten up and went back to his boulder and picked it back up. He gave her a meaningful look that could have said it all. To be the best, he announced proudly. Best at what? Best swordsman in the world. He had a confident grin. He had a lot of determination. What drives you to that goal? Luffy asked with a sly smile. Even though she didn't know the teen's backstory, she already knew the answer perfectly well. A promise. Luffy gripped the straw hat on head with one hand and the other around her necklace, her signature grin plastered on her face, as she stared right into the swordsman's soul. That's the best kind. Luffy patted herself down. We'll meet again. I hope my words will serve you well. She grinned before turning away to explore the rest of the island. Luffy had stayed on the island for a couple of days, just looking around, mainly in the forest on the outside of the valley. There was no need to see the swordsman since he would have questions about her advice, but he needed to think about them himself. To Luffy's surprise, there were a lot of wild animals that she had fed off, and she had fed Ko over the couple of days with large boars and other creatures. But on her last day she had returned to the village and noticed a graveyard with very few graves. Luffy walked in, head held low, her hat shadowing her eyes. She stopped at a grave and faced it head on. It wasn't like her, but she knew how to show respect. She tipped her precious straw hat to the grave and thanked girl for what she had done. Kuina, Luffy read, you have showed a great amount of ambition for swordsmanship. It would have been great to meet you when you were alive, and thank you for all you've done for Zoro. I don't know your story, but it will be shared. With that, Luffy had said her goodbyes to the island. She was looking forward to meeting the swordsman again. Maybe he would join her future pirate crew. That would have been nice, but she had a fair way to go before that happened.